All right, folks, welcome back to Mike Morris's Mind Escape. We are joined tonight by our buddy and friend of the show, Martin Ferretti. We're going to be discussing Gnosticism and Gnosis tonight. You can check out Martin at thealchemicalmind.com, or you can check out his podcast on Apple Podcasts, and I'm sure most of the podcast platforms. And yeah, he's definitely worth a listen. If you have not checked it out already, go subscribe tonight. And if you are interested, head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/mindescapepodcast for just $2 a month. You'll get exclusive guest episodes and segments. We've got a ton of stuff up there. We just recorded one with Anthony Tyler. There's a few of them that we've done with him on there now. We've got one with Rick Strassman. Rick Strassman's on there. Who else? Laura, the Megalith Hunter, just uploaded one with her. Matthew Clark on the Eleusinian Mysteries. Laird Scranton, just tons of good stuff on there. So go check that out. Also, go find us on Discord if you're interested in chatting. And from there, you should go to indrasweb.org, which is a social media platform we created to connect open minds. It is live. We are still working on getting in the App Store, so hold on to your hats for that one. But we are working on it. And one more thing before we get started. If anybody's interested, we are going to give away a Mind Escape t-shirt at the end of October. If you are interested, all you have to do is go to Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review, take a screenshot, and send it to mindescapepodcast@gmail.com, and that'll enter you to win. So look at that beauty right there. Also, we do have a new merch store. So if you are interested in just buying merch, you can check out the link down below. It's our TeePublic store, and we've got shirts, hoodies, mugs, wall art, notebooks. There's just tons of stuff on there. Lots of cool designs too. You can get yourself a #Let Maurice Speak t-shirt, or the Portara at Naxos, or there's tons of stuff on there. So go check that out. But welcome back on the show, Martin. How are you?
Always a treat, fellas.
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful.
Nice
Thanks
to
for
be
joining
on.
us.
Yeah, nice to be on.
Yeah.
Actually, I enjoyed the episodes with Laura because I was doing some research, some genealogy research, and apparently there's like a Ferretti fortress. There was a
Nice.
Ferretti that was like a Templar and built some fortress when the Knights of Malta were there. So I told my dad we should go just to see. It's like a restaurant now, so but still be cool to go.
Yeah, I mean, it looks
Sweet.
beautiful on Malta. I would love to check it out as well. I'd
Yeah.
like to check out that whole, Greece, Italy, where my family's from, in southern Italy. Actually, I think my family's from Calabria, but there's a town there. That's where Crotone, I think that's where the Pythagoreans had their ascetic cult back in the day. So I'd like to maybe head into that region, so.
Yeah, you might have some apostolic succession from the Pythagoreans. You never know.
But yeah, so tonight I thought we'd talk about something you discuss a lot on your show, which is Gnosis and Gnosticism, and just, talk a little bit about the history of it and how some of these ideas evolved and where people are at on them these days. So how did you get interested in like the topic of, Gnosticism or Gnosis?
So I tend to hop from east to west. And so when I decided to leave the church that I was raised in and went pretty deep into Buddhism, out of the blue, somehow, I can't remember if it was in actual philosophy class or if somebody had mentioned the book to me, but somebody had given me a copy of the Gnostic Bible, which is, I don't even know if it's in print anymore. It might be, but it's a rather lengthy tome. It's got a lot of the stuff that you find in the Nag Hammadi library. There's a collected edition of that, but also some of the things that you don't have on there. And actually, it's funny that you mentioned that because I keep this everywhere I go. This is with me.
Wait, hold that up again. I think the screen.
Yeah, sure.
Nice.
Nag Hammadi scriptures.
If anybody doesn't know what Nag Hammadi,
massive book.
Yeah, they were found. Some early Christian texts and some Gnostic texts were found in 1945 in Egypt.
Yep.
So definitely an interesting component of this tale.
Yeah, and there's some of the translations took quite a long time to come out. I think for a few decades we only had maybe half a dozen texts, and there's still even new ones coming up now. I think One of the more famous ones, probably because it was, like cover of National Geographic and dealt with a topic that maybe some, we'll say, hardcore Christians maybe don't want to deal with, was the Gospel of Judas. That was, I think, it came out in '06. And every few years, you get some inkling of some new text that's translated, or they find pieces of some other texts that we didn't have like a full piece of text on, right?
Hmm.
So like there's one called the Three Stellas, for example, that it's like impossible to read because there's so much missing out of the text, right?
Right.
So you might get like some verbs and nouns, and maybe you can piece the message. But at that point, it's not something that you can do. Like, for example, you can never teach it in like a sermon, right? Maybe if you were to do it on a philosophy podcast like my own, you can maybe dive into it a little bit. But in terms of getting people to understand it and want to read it, it'd be almost impossible, right? Because not only is the language esoteric, because as a Gnostic you're kind of seeking this secret knowledge, but by not having a full story, it's pretty difficult. Um, yeah, so I was given that book, and I went pretty deep into Gnosticism for several years. Um, never never quite going back into my Christian roots, really. So I was still kind of disowning a lot of that stuff. But I mean, I was enthralled by the cosmology and the mythology of a lot of the Gnostic sects. In fact, I named my daughter Zoe because of my interest in Gnosticism. Zoe is a central character in the for the Gnostics, and it means life, right? And so when my daughter was born, I automatically knew that's what I had to name her. And so it's been a journey for many years, right? So Zoe is 11 now. I don't consider myself a Gnostic. I don't believe there's such a thing, and we can get into that a little bit. But I think there's a lot of really interesting philosophy in those texts, and a lot of interesting history that arises as a result of the interplay between what is today considered Gnostics and what would be considered more of the Catholic Church, right? The
Hmm.
Orthodoxy. So yeah.
Well, yeah, let's get into a little bit of the basics and where it comes from. First of all, there's a guy I think in the 17th century that actually coined the term Gnosticism. It's not like it was known as that throughout history. But the word comes from Gnostikos, which means having knowledge in ancient Greece, and Plato used it as like having like a knowledge or like a personal experience through, gaining knowledge through personal experience, whether it be spiritual or some sort of knowledge quest type seeking thing. But so that's kind of where it comes from, and I think the influence of where we start to learn about it is actually what is it? Irenaeus was the second century.
Irenaeus, yep.
Irenaeus, yeah, it's first or second century A.D. and he was actually he called the Gnostics heretics because it was Gnosticism. Their belief is that we are kind of like an imperfect creation from an imperfect creator, and there is a true God, but that the God that we know of from most of the Abrahamic religions is not the one true God.
Yes. So I want to make a clear point with what you said, because the saying always goes, and I know Anthony, he probably used it last night when you guys recorded, but he loves using it. So, history is written by the victors, right?
We
And
were talking
so
about that the other day, actually.
yeah,
Maurice
he
brought it up 2 episodes ago, actually.
that's
Chew
right.
on that.
Well, and yeah, and it's true, and it's particularly true when it comes to the Gnostics. There is no Gnostic religion, right? Gnosticism is really just a kind of catch-all term for a very diverse group of people in a very large geographic area. So, you have Gnostics in Greece, you have Gnostics in the Near East, you have Gnostics in the Far East, and anywhere in between. Generally, when we talk about Gnostics in the modern sense, it is kind of an offshoot of Christianity, or maybe even an earlier version of Christianity, depending on how you want to read the text and what text you look at. But there's no group of Gnostics, right? So you had people like the Sethians, the Valentinians, the Thomasines, like all kinds of groups that strived for this secret knowledge. And so a lot of the texts sometimes reference things like, these are the secret sayings that were given by Jesus, right? That's how the Gospel of Thomas starts, or Thomas starts, where you're transcribing secret knowledge from one person to another, right? It's not like in Orthodoxy where knowledge is handed from the top down, where you have, priests and, whatever else, apostles, anything else. But everyone's kind of a brother, right? And that you find that in the core teachings of Jesus. And so knowledge is transmitted through direct personal experience from one person to the other. Now, yes, there would be people that would be maybe in charge of a community, let's say. But in terms of having someone be above somebody else, not so much as you see in the Orthodoxy.
But that's
and
the point,
and that
right?
plays, yeah, well, of course, and that plays a large role in what you're saying about the church fathers. All the church fathers would tell you that the Gnostics are heretics. Number one, that's why they use this catch-all term, right? Because it really means nothing, right? The church fathers often would use a term like Gnostikoi to describe these people, but it really didn't mean anything, right? What's interesting, though, is a lot of the things that we now consider to be kind of core Christian values, for example, the divinity of Jesus, are things that come from the Gnostic sects. Before the Gnostics, there was no real way to understand who Jesus was, right? For some people, he was just a person. For some, he was a rabbi. For some, he was a prophet. For some, he was the Messiah. For some, he was literally God. And it wasn't until, much later, 4th century, when some of these things start getting established, that we get kind of what we believe today in the Christian world. But that idea came, I would say, in large part from the Valentinians, because Gnostics, regardless of the sect, often have this very convoluted cosmology of the universe, right? So you touched upon this idea that God didn't actually create the world. And that leads into some fallacies where a lot of folks feel like the Gnostics were dualist. And, maybe on paper it seems that way. I don't know how true that is in actuality.
Yeah, I mean, I
because
never
we just
thought
don't
of it.
know.
Yeah, I never thought of it in that terms. The way I
No, I'm not
interpret
talking
it,
about you. I'm talking about
I
in
know.
terms of, people that study this kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just saying, I think that the way I've interpreted it, at least, is that there is this higher being, this energy or whatever it is, and some other being that thought, that's the way I interpret it, is the Yalda oath, or this demiurge created the world. I mean, there's like a whole thing it goes into with Sophia, who's the sacred feminine, emanating without its male counterpart, which would have been Christ, creating Yalda oath. Yalda oath created the world. That's what most people know as Yahweh. And Gnosticism seems to be some sort of like influence, or it's been influenced by Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and like Plato's theory of forms, kind of like all mixed into one.
Well, actually, and funny enough, I mean, there's excerpts of the Republic in the Nag Hammadi text, so
Yeah.
that should tell you quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, the cosmology is interesting. So you do have an ultimate God, right? A divine being, a source. That God is kind of a three-part God. Really, it's kind of almost an infinite part God, but this tripartite God. And in essence, a lot of that is taken from Hermeticism. So really, this ultimate God entity is kind of like Father, Mother, and Son. And so the divine feminine really is the Barbello, not Sophia. Sophia is kind of an emanation that comes out from this ultimate divinity, into different aeons. And so the aeons are kind of aspects of the universe, right? So you would have like mind or forethought.
Hmm.
Um, those kind of things are the eons. And Sophia is one of these eons, right? Wisdom. Um, the interesting thing is because the ultimate source is male and female, um, all the aeons that emanate all these different aspects of the universe are all also male and female. Not male and female in that they have different genitalia or breasts or whatever, but in terms of the type of energy that they emanate out of themselves. Um, you guys know I love language, and so you don't see this in something like English, but in a Romance language where you would have words that dictate a gender based on, for example, in Spanish, if you end in O, it's a masculine noun. If it's an A, it's a feminine noun. For the most part, not always. It's the same kind of thing, right? So these basic ideas that have male qualities or female qualities, right? Like if you go into maybe magical circles, kind of left hand versus right hand paths, and and that's how the emanations come about. So Sophia, in her infinite wisdom, because she is the embodiment of wisdom, decides that she came from this source, and so she must also have the ability to create like the source. And so she decides not to discuss this with her partner, her male counterpart, and simply creates life out of her own self. The problem with this, of course, is that it goes counter to how the universe is supposed to work, I guess, because you don't have the balance of male and female. And as a result, she gives birth to the demiurge, which is a Platonic character. The term is straight out of Plato. And the demiurge is kind of this like disfigured serpent with a lion's head.
Yeah, you can
And you
find an
do
image
see,
on like Wikipedia. It's like a
yeah,
yeah, it's like a cross between a few things,
yeah.
like a
Uh,
lion, serpent, something, a face.
and so because Sophia gave birth to this figure without the full knowledge of creation, simply out of her own self-sufficient knowledge, I guess. Um, the demiurge isn't perfect. Obviously, by his symbolism, right, with the snake at the lion's head, you can kind of see that he's kind of an ugly-looking guy. But he's also very conceited and thinks he knows everything. And so he decides he will also create out of himself, by himself, and brings out these archons that emanate from him. And the archons are not always negative aspects of the universe, but they do tend to reflect more material aspects of the universe. Whereas the Bethos, the divine source, is emanating more philosophical concepts. The demiurge emanates physical concepts, and so the material world is born out of the demiurge and the archons, and their purpose is simply to create beings, basically, that worship them as the ultimate source. Um, Now, as Sophia sees all this, she kind of gets weirded out. She realizes her mistake, and she goes to the source and apologizes. And so Source kind of sends part of himself in Christ, in that essence, to kind of rectify the wrongs to Sophia. But of course, that takes a long period of time. So you have a succession of like mirror mythologies going on, with the suffering of Sophia going down into her daughter Zoe, who at one point is raped by the demiurge. That suffering moves into physicality in terms of Eve, and so that's why Eve has to bear the brunt of all these things. And when you have this core philosophy and understanding of the female, the divine feminine, as being a part of the divine, but having to kind of reunite itself with wholeness, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
You get a very different perspective on the role of women in your belief system. And that becomes pretty obvious in texts like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, right? She plays a big role in it. And
Yeah,
it's,
is that the one where Mary in that script or that text. I think that's from Nag Hammadi too, correct? That
Yeah.
one where they talk about how Mary uh, actually plays a more important role, and all the other apostles are basically jealous of her and her connection to Jesus and everything.
Which, I mean, if you start diving really deep into the like a linguistic understanding of this, it makes sense, right? So Mary is Mary of Magdalene. A Magdala is kind of the pillars to enter a city or oftentimes a temple. And so, as a result of just simply her name, she is the entryway into the fullness of Christ, right? And so certain sects of Gnostics would see Mary Magdalene as having a prominent role, just like some see Judas as having a prominent role, right? If Judas hadn't done what he did, then Christ couldn't accomplish his goal of dying for our sins, right?
Right.
Most Christians, Gnostics didn't believe in sin or repentance,
They
but
did
there
believe
had to
in
be
salvation, though, right? I think
uh,
salvation is one of the.
in essence. So basically, you can achieve a certain point. I mean, there's such a varied number of sects that it's hard to say, well, this is what Gnostics believe.
Exactly.
Um, some would say yes. It just depends on how much the sect emphasizes the nature of the physical body. Right. So in medieval times, you have sects like the Cathars that rose up, and they believed that the body was completely evil, right? Because the demiurge created it,
Hmm.
and the demiurge simply it wants to fool us from attaining our true nature. And so they had marriage, kind of, but they didn't have sex, they didn't have kids. And of course, how do you disseminate a belief system if you have nobody to bring on to disseminate it with, right? Unless you're just converting people all the time to your belief system. Aside from crusades that were done to eradicate the group, but they didn't believe in the sacraments, for example, right? Like the only sacrament they had was the consolamentum, which is more like a laying on hands by people that are advanced in this secret esoteric knowledge, right, that they
Well,
teach.
yeah, I think it was the
Uh,
what did I read? It's like Gnostics considered the principal element of salvation to be direct knowledge of the supreme
mhm.
divinity in the form of mystical or esoteric insights.
And again, depends on the sect, right? I think for a large number of these people, there was maybe no name for it at that point. But when Dionysus begins doing his writing, Pseudo Dionysus, he brings in the concept of agnosia, right? Which, if you're into Eastern philosophy, you're very familiar with, right? So it's knowledge through unknowing, basically the same or similar concept as Kensho or Satori, right, for the Buddhists, where the point is you get to a place of knowing yourself, right? Something that comes up constantly in the Greek world. Know thyself. And when you truly know thyself, then you don't need to know anything else, right? Because then you acquire the full knowledge of the universe. So at that point, for the Gnostics, you would re-enter the pleroma, right? So the pleroma is the ethereal realm where ultimate souls resides. And it's not like in Orthodox Christianity where there's a heaven up in the sky somewhere, and you die and you go to this place. The pleroma is above that, right? Because heaven would have been created by the demiurge in a physical universe, right? It might be some ethereal spot in the universe, but it's still within the universe. The Bethos lives outside of the universe, right? So if you wanted to do like a modern scientific look at this, you could do multiple universe theory, right? The demiurge creates our universe, but there may be multiple demiurges, and encompassing all this is the Bethos,
Hmm.
um, the depths, right? So that's what it translates to, and that realm is beyond any physicality, right? It would be like going into some super DMT trip, I guess. That would be a comparison maybe to what the pleroma is, where you're beyond concept, right? There's no right or wrong or left or right or anything like that. Everything exists as is, and you simply view it as is and experience it as is. Um, and that's ultimately what a lot of the Gnostics are trying to do, is get away from dogma. Although of course there's always people trying to gain power through dogma, so these things happen. Um, but ultimately, for the Gnostics, they don't need hierarchy in a church. They don't even need church buildings,
Right.
right? And you even see this in the New Testament. Jesus never says anything about build a church, right? For Jesus, the church is the body of Christ, right? A group of people communing and
Well,
talking about these things and sharing knowledge.
this seems to be like the first, like them being labeled heretical. They seem like a people that were more well read. They looked into other traditions and religions and things like that, and maybe took some of the ideas, as we mentioned, the different influences before. But then, you have Irenaeus talking about how they're heretics and everything like that. So does that,
Mhm.
would that point to the fact that then that's the first instance of the church imposing its control on the idea of what Christianity actually is? Because they're putting their foot down and they're saying, okay, you do need a conduit to God, and we're the priests, the popes, whatever, are all, what I'm saying, are all those conduits in between. Is where Gnostics would probably say you don't need that. You can have direct, knowledge or communion with this God or whatever.
Um, I mean, in some senses, yes. You got to remember though, a lot of the Gnostic texts can be dated to earlier than things we consider to be Orthodox texts. Maybe sometimes not that much earlier, and it is tough.
Well, some of
But I
them do
mean,
have hermetic. They did find like some hermetic text in the Nag
and the
Hammadi.
thing is that there are Gnostic texts that predate Christianity,
Right.
right? So obviously, it's not purely a Christian thing, but there's a lot of influx in this world, right? We think that just because they didn't have airplanes and
Right.
automobiles, they're not
Well,
traveling around
that's not.
sharing
But I mean,
knowledge.
I guess my point wasn't that that's when it popped up, but other than that's when
Mhm.
you start to see them being labeled as something else other than part of this other thing, right? Like that's what I'm saying. That's where I
Yeah.
see a divergence in Christianity, where Christians are saying that's not us. This is us over here. That's you. It's wrong, and that's kind of what I was trying to highlight there.
Yes, but I don't think you see that really until probably Athanasius. So that would be like late third century, early fourth century.
So a good couple hundred
But
years after you have,
several hundred years
yeah,
after, yeah. So like Athanasius, you mentioned Clement, and all these church fathers. That's much later, right? That's why you don't have things like the Council of Nicaea until much later, because when these sects start popping up, you do have this thing vying for power, right? Rome wasn't always the seat of the Orthodox Church, right? There was a very long, drawn-out battle for where the seat would be between Alexandria and Rome, and that was part of the council, right? And the main argument that ended up with Rome being chosen as the seat of the church was this idea of, is Christ God or is Christ man, right? Is it
hmm.
just Jesus, or is he part of God, or is he God? And I think that's something that you even see Christians today kind of wondering about, right, between different denominations.
And wasn't
Um,
Alexandria kind of like one of the main platforms for Gnosticism too? But like that was like one of the main places where obviously you have a lot of learning and multicultural things happening because of Alexander the Great and the library at Alexandria and everything. So
I mean, Alexandria would have been like the ancient world's New York City, right?
right,
There's
Hmm.
every race, every color, every religion, every language, that's all in Alexandria. And so, of course, when you have a place that's so inclusive, let me just say, doesn't necessarily mean everyone liked each other, and that they didn't fight each other, but where you can get as much knowledge as you want, whenever you want, if you want to partake in it, then yeah, of course, you're going to have a larger movement, a larger progression in philosophy and various other sciences, and that's very obvious by the amount of people that studied in Alexandria, right? If you go and start looking at names that you recognize from science and philosophy, 95% of them, if they lived in this time period, they studied or had some place in Alexandria where they taught something. That's just where you had to be. And that's because of the rules that Alexandria had in place in terms of confiscating goods from ships, from merchant ships, right? So any ship that ported at Alexandria, if they had any kind of text on the ship, the text was confiscated, sent to the library at that point. It would be they would keep the original, they would make a copy, and you would receive a copy back. But the original remained in Alexandria, and that's why you had so many texts there. And it's this that allowed for such a large growth of Alexandria as a civilization center. But yes, that always leads down to greed because, you have these people in Rome that are part of the empire that say, well, hey, Paul was here first. We should have the power here, right? We have direct apostolic succession, not those guys in Alexandria. And it just comes down to the same everywhere you go, right? You see this with Muslims, with the Shia and the other groups. But Alexandria was the place to be. If there was one place in history, that's where I would go. In particular, to see how maybe correct or incorrectly we've gotten some of the history. I think that'd be fascinating to see. And because it's in such a central place, you do have a lot of influence from different religions, right? So Hermetic influence on the Gnostics is obvious. Platonic influence is obvious. There were Buddhist monks traveling the Greek and Roman Empire. People don't know that, but the Buddhists were there 200 BC, trying to preach the gospel of the Buddha. So all these ideas are floating around in this time frame, and it's just like a melting pot. Which is, by the way, where I went to dinner tonight. It was delicious. But
Did you get the fondue?
Yeah, we sure did. It was great.
Yeah,
it's delicious. Let's get into now the Adam and Eve thing, because on one hand you have the main story from the Bible. You have Adam, you have Eve. God tells them not to eat the apple of truth, or whatever you want to call it, good and evil.
Knowledge of good and evil. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's I think most people know that version of it. Now, the Gnostic version is the snake that's tempting Adam and Eve is not actually bad, but is actually the true God urging Adam and Eve to eat from, the apple of truth, of good and evil, so that they can obtain that knowledge and then become, as the gods, or, have that knowledge. So I think that's where the idea of it's not that it's like more or better in some way, but if you think about it like that, it kind of does make sense. Like in the original version, why were humans not supposed to have that now? Like that doesn't make any sense. We're just supposed to wander ignorantly through time and space and whatever. So that's where I think there is a lucrative aspect to this, where the God of Gnosticism wants you to have the knowledge, wants you to have those ideas and experience those things, as opposed to, like, let's say Christianity, where you need a priest or a conduit, and you have to go, you have a go-between, to get to God, as where you could have that firsthand knowledge if you were a Gnostic.
So, regardless of the sect, the thing you have to remember is the Gnostics were the first hippies. And it was pretty obvious, right? If you spend just a few minutes of your time thinking through some of the things that are taught in this example, the Old Testament, right? So we're not picking on the Old Testament, but we're talking about Gnostic Christians. They're growing up and they're saying, well, why would God tell me not to worship any of the gods because there's no other gods before me, right? If there's no other gods before God, then why would he have to tell me that, right?
Right.
That should be obvious, right?
Yeah,
So
that's a good
either there
point.
are more gods or you're not the one true God, right? And so a lot of them realize that, okay, there could be other gods. None of them are the one true God. So let's figure out what the one true God is. And how do we do that? Well, we do that through knowing ourselves and seeing what is actually true and what's not true. Um, you know, the story of the garden is actually really interesting, and I mean, you hit it pretty much dead on. Um, the the one thing that is missing in some of the interpretations, and I think it shows up in the Secret Book of John, is why the demiurge says that, right? Because it's not just the demiurge, right? He works in tandem with all the archons. Um, and that's why he says, we created man in our image, right? Because it's not just in the demiurge's image, but in all the archons as well.
Right.
And they seek to they just want somebody to worship them, right? Because they feel they're so important that somebody must feel that they're important. They have a Napoleon complex, I guess you could say.
Just like my
But
dad.
Ooh, boom, got him.
He doesn't watch, so I
I'll
don't
have to
have
make a
worry.
clip, send it
Yeah.
his way.
Lucky you.
He's
Yeah, don't send them
attacking.
that clip. But part of this happens when Sophia kind of pleads with the demiurge to like make him stop doing what he's doing, and she tells him about the Bethos, and he's like, well, crap. So I'm not the one true God, but I tell everybody that I am, and I have all this power. So like, I need to make it appear that I am, right?
Hmm.
And so that's why he tells them not to eat of this, because he has a conversation with the archons. We have to tell them that this is the case. Otherwise, they're going to know that they're just as powerful as us, right? They also are God. And that's a very, we talk about Vedanta all the time, right? Every time I'm on, I bring up Vedanta. But that's very much an Eastern thing. And you see that ultimately at the core of Hindu philosophy too, right? In Hindu philosophy, everyone thinks that Hinduism is this polytheistic religion because there are thousands of gods, right? And that might be true, but ultimately there is only one God, right? The Brahman.
Hmm.
And everything emanates out of Brahman, and everything is just a manifestation of an aspect of Brahman.
Well, I was going to say that's
Um,
our buddy, and I don't know if we've mentioned this, but our buddy studies Vedanta. Shout out to Chris. He
mhm.
explained it as all the terms having to do with Vedanta and the separation of things. There actually is only one thing, but they had to create these terms so that people would understand kind of what's going on, because it's hard to understand if you don't have that context.
You got to dumb it down, you know. I was somebody asked me at work yesterday about the tattoo I have on my forearm, right? So I have a Penrose triangle on my forearm, and I got it because I had it in a trip that I had, and so I said, "Well, crap, I need to get this." And so she asked me about it, and like, what am I gonna say, right? Like I was tripping on shrooms,
Hmm.
and Horace came to me and set the symbol on my arm. Like she's gonna think I'm nuts, right? Um, so I kind of just explained kind of what the meaning of it is, sort of, a simple meaning.
Right.
Just mentioned like impossible objects, and that was a mistake because I figured by mentioning impossible objects it would be just a simple conversation, but she couldn't understand impossible objects, right? Um, so it's the same with these stories, right? You always have to tell these kind of stories in allegory. And that's where the gnosis aspect comes around, right? It's a secret esoteric knowledge, right? Gnosis isn't just knowledge, right? In English, we have, you have knowledge and wisdom, but they seem somewhat separate, right? And this is why I love Greek, because in Greek, you can just add suffixes or prefixes to words, and you can have like a billion variations of any particular concept to denote specific aspects of it, right?
Right.
In Spanish, you have like in many languages, you have two verbs to be, right? One being like a temporary being and one being a permanent being, right? So your name would be with one version of the verb. And, if you feel something, that's a temporary being. So it's a different verb, but they both mean to be. And the same is with Greek, right? I mean, last I counted, there's like 26 different types of knowledge, right? All stemming from this GNO root word.
Well, yeah, and
And
was there like 4 different words for love in Greek too?
yeah, and I mean, you can express that in English, but it takes a sentence, right?
Right.
Brotherly love, parently love,
Right.
romantic love, lust, whatever, right? Whereas in Greek, they all stem from this root, and so you know what the root concept is, and you can kind of gather the meaning as a result. So dumbing down concepts sometimes works very well, but oftentimes it makes things more complicated. And I think you see that in a lot of modern languages, and maybe that's part of some of the issues we have socially nowadays. Not completely, but I love studying language, and so I always look at the linguistic aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean it's again, and actually I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but there's a lot of people I know, like I watch it on Twitter. There's a lot of people that make the connection in the UFO stuff to like archons being gray aliens or something along those lines, or that gray archetype. Uh,
Yeah. And there's been some very smart people that have appropriated Gnostic mythology to their own ends and means, right? I'm not saying these people never experienced an encounter with an archon or anything like that. I don't know. I wasn't there. If they say they
right.
did, cool, right?
I think it's just
But
it's just like a misinterpretation, or like people like looking to connect dots that maybe aren't necessarily there. Like what,
yeah,
because there's this whole like they want to uncover the mystery, right? So you go back, like what's the ancient stuff, like what are these, what does the ancient knowledge have to say about this? Oh, this could fit with this kind of a thing, this could be this. So yeah, I mean it's one of those things that I think gets misinterpreted, especially with this specifically.
we have such vast minds and imaginations, or potentially.
Yeah, we want to tell
Uh,
stories. You've seen
but yeah, but the thing is, most people don't even make up stories, right? They just retell the same
that's
story,
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were
right?
talking
And
about
so
that
that's why you call back to the Gnostic myth because it's cool and people don't know about it, right? And so people start saying, "Oh, like where did this come from?" Right? Let me study Gnosticism. Oh yeah, these guys they knew about archons 2,000 years ago,
Right.
right? So they've been in control of the world for 2,000 years. Maybe, or maybe you're just appropriating somebody else's interesting story, right? We appropriate stories all the time. Stories change meaning all the time, right? The story of Jesus in terms of the mythology isn't a new story. It's a rehash of Dionysus and God knows how many other ones.
Cyrus, I mean, you can go on.
You can go back tens of thousands of years and it's there. So
Well, I was gonna say, don't you think that the whole idea of God as a man in the sky is kind of what you're saying is like it's like a dumbed down
yeah.
concept, so people can kind of grasp their head around that? Like, everyone doesn't have the biggest IQ, so if you start explaining to them quantum physics or like energy in that kind of regard, they're not gonna grasp that. If you say, okay, there's an all-knowing big bearded man in the sky, it's a lot easier to kind of attach that to a god.
Yes, yes. And that's why usually if somebody asks me if I believe in God, I just say yes. And if they want me to explain it, I just said God is everywhere and I just leave it at that, right? Because if I go any deeper, like I'll just lose everybody, right?
Right.
And that's why I talk about that kind of stuff in my podcast and not in public, right? For one, I don't like talking politics or religion in general in public because we all know how that goes.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, I don't care. Like, you can worship whatever God you want, right? My daughter's talking about she worship is the Roman gods or something now, right? Like that's her thing, because they're doing ancient religions in school. So she did a project on Osiris, which was very interesting. They did the Greek gods, the Roman gods, all kinds of stuff, and now she loves like Athena and Zeus and those guys. So she's like, well, that's what I believe in, and that's fine, right? To me, it doesn't matter, right? Because to me, whether you worship Jesus or Zeus or Buddha or, Lucifer or whoever, to me, it's all the same God, right? It's just a different manifestation, a different aspect of that ultimate reality. So you can worship however you want, whoever you want. It makes no difference to me. To me, we worship the same God. Whether you believe that or not is up to you, right? But that's what I believe.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, I was asked. This is what Maurice and I were fighting about the other night. I said, "Where are these gods? Like where?"
I was listening last night. Yeah.
Where did they come from? Where are like where are these gods? And I mean, I have my take, which is that they come from altered states of consciousness, whether it be entheogens and psychedelics or meditation, deep prayer, or I don't know, whatever. However you get to that place, sleep paralysis or lucid dreaming, whatever. And his take is that well, I mean, it's not necessarily his, but almost like we have Laird Scranton on. He talks about these shifts, and like sometimes you have these golden age periods or like the yuga cycles, and sometimes we're closer to this knowledge or these points in time where we're closer to some sort of metaphysical being or structure or something. I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, my personal thing is that I think that now we just know so much that we can kind of move beyond that. And that's not to say there isn't something greater than us other than the things that have been put forth in the past might just have been that interpretations of the past. And we need to update those interpretations.
I mean, I think you're actually both correct. I was actually going to text you after I heard Maurice talking.
Should have got him
night.
on here and really went crazy.
Yeah, I was going to shoot you a text, but I was like, nah, I'm sure it'll come up tomorrow when we chat. No, I think you guys are actually both right. And that might seem like a cop-out answer, but again, to me, it's not. To me, you guys are both talking about the same thing, but coming from different angles, right? So Maurice is super woke Maurice, right? And so he's looking at it in a more spiritual sense. And Mike, you've kind of gone much more into the logical side as of late. And I know you go back and forth, right? Because I've been a listener for a long time, so I've seen you go back and forth. Right now, you're at one extreme. I don't think you're saying anything different than Maurice is, right?
Can I make an argument for my point, though, real quick, before you go any further?
Yeah, of course.
When you say that, I guess I don't think I'm better than Maurice. I don't have any better ideas, per se. Like, I don't look down upon what he's saying or thinking or whatever. I would just point out that I've read so many different people's takes on these topics, like probably most people's takes, like credible ones, or scientific papers or books or whatever, the top ones on all these topics, where I put together an idea and realize that those are just people too. That's their interpretations. So I still take my own interpretations from those interpretations, but it's like what works best for me. I guess then what we're saying is either we know nothing, and you could go, like I know that I know nothing, go back to ancient Greece or Socrates. So you could say that, or you can say we have an idea because, like, for instance, science, like we know science works. We're talking through technology that was created by science. If it was flawed in some way, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation. So I guess that's just my logical mind going to that. But I'm just pointing out that either we none of us are right, or one of us is onto something. And I'm not necessarily saying again that it's me, but I will say that he would even admit I put in way more time and research into these things. So.
So I will say I accept your argument, and if that's the way you want to go about it, that's up to you, right? I'm not saying you're wrong, and I'm not saying Maurice is wrong. I'm not saying either of you are right. I'm saying you're both equally correct, right? But you're coming at it from different perspectives. So to look at your technology example, if we were 2,000 years ago, okay, let's say there actually was a man named Jesus who turned water into wine, right? So if I'm at this feast and I see this man Jesus turning water into wine, I'm going to say, of course I believe in Jesus. This man just turned water into wine. Nobody has ever done that before, right?
Right.
So this is the same argument that you're presenting in terms of technology. We know that science, there must be something to science, because here we are with all this cool, fancy stuff. You can say the same argument in terms of religion, right? You can say, well, I know that religion works. However, you want to, you know, define religion. I know that's probably very personal.
Right.
But I know that religion works. Here, I'll give you an example for me. There is no doubt in my mind that God exists. Okay. There is nothing that anybody could say to me to prove me otherwise because of the direct personal experiences that I've had, whether chemically induced or, through meditation or anything else. I feel like I have experienced that. Right. And to me, it was very profound. So, I mean, you can't tell me that my experience wasn't true, just like I can tell you that the benefits of science aren't true, right? Both are equally true. One for you, one for me. But I agree,
Well,
science is important.
I'm
Now,
not
the
denying
thing
the
is,
gnosis though. That's the difference. Like I'm not denying his gnosis. I'm just saying that um you everything is always evolving. So for me, that's been my philosophy of the last year and a half, 2 years, is that I'm going to keep evolving with these ideas. I'm not going to slow down, because if I put all my eggs in
sure.
one basket and say for sure this exists or for sure that exists, I think it's going to slow my knowledge quest down, and it's going to, it's going to make me into somebody like you see out there. Somebody wrote a book and then 20 years goes by and they're still defending that same book. They haven't evolved any sort of thought or context or anything. So I guess that's what, for me, that's what I'm afraid of. And I think that if you make a stand or take a stand sometimes, yeah, it might look lucrative in the short term. And I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying about what you believe. Like, you for sure
Yeah, yeah, no.
know that there's a God. I'm not arguing that. That's fine. What I'm saying is, if you said, I know that there's a God, and then this is who it is, and this is why I think that, then I would start to push back a little. So I guess
Even I would push back. Yeah.
that's where I change my tune on that. It's not that I don't believe that there's something more. It's that the idea that somebody knows for sure what that something more is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and nobody does, right? Just like religion isn't perfect, philosophy is not perfect, science is not perfect, right? There's a fantastic movie that delves directly into the topic of tonight. Maybe not directly with the Gnostics, but it is the time period. It is in Alexandria, and it deals a lot with the power play between orthodoxy and people like the Gnostics. Called Agora. I've talked about it on my podcast before. It's a Rachel Weisz movie. And it takes place, I think, at the end of the 290s ish. I can't remember, but it's about what's her name, Hippolyta of Alexandria, and her struggles as a woman teaching,
She's
basically
the first
all
woman
men classes.
philosopher, right?
Yes, yes. And through much of the movie, she's trying to figure out why there's something wrong with, I think it's the orbit of Mercury, and she's trying to use Pythagorean math and all kinds of different ways of looking at orbits, but can never figure it out until the end, after she's exiled from Alexandria, when basically the Pope of Alexandria, which there were multiple popes at the time, when the Pope of Alexandria basically kills everybody at this temple. It's a hermetic temple, but they teach philosophy, and it's open to basically middle class and wealthy people of the empire. And so she's on this boat and figures out this motion thing by dropping. I think this actually is one of the examples shown for like relativity. Drops a rock while the ship is moving, and the rock falls straight down, right? And how could that be? If the boat is movement, it should be falling at an angle. And uses this to determine that the reason why the orbits are wrong is that the orbit is kind of slanted and not just a circle going around. All this to illustrate that you can have a method of acquiring knowledge or proving a system to be true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that will always prove the system to be true. There were very advanced models of around the Earth and the universe where the sun was at the center of the universe. Notice I said universe, not just solar system. And those models were basically just circles, right? But if you start doing ovals, ellipses, you start doing slanted orbits, you get much more interesting, complicated mathematics, which didn't exist, right? So you have to create it. So the model works for the time that you're in, with the knowledge that you have, with your understanding of the universe. And as your understanding expands, your methodology has to also expand, right? So, the model that they had then didn't work. It was, tweaked a little bit and it was closer to reality, right? But not quite there yet, right? And all I'm saying is that you're right. Technology has gotten us to a place that is arguably great, arguably maybe not so great, right? Depending on your outlook on life.
Sure.
But in 50 years, in 100 years, in 500, in 1,000, and 10,000, that model should also progress, right? Unless there's some cataclysm, right? Whatever that might be.
Well, I told Maurice, unless a solar flare happens and wipes everything out. I mean, because really, I mean, if that happened, as long as the knowledge is preserved or something like that, that's one thing. But if that happened, I mean, we'd really be out of business in terms of what we're used to in this current modern day idea of technology.
Yeah. I was actually talking to my daughter about that today because we started watching Foundation on Apple TV. And, that's a central theme on how they're going to save the empire. And they're creating this like colony to decide what knowledge to preserve or not. And I told her about solar flares, and she's like, "What's that?" So I explain it. And she's like, "You mean I can't talk to my friends on Discord anymore?" So she starts coming up with like all these ways that she can communicate, right? So like carrier pigeons and like a bicycle or whatever. Like I don't know.
Back to the nitty gritty.
Yeah, for sure. But you got to think about these things, right? Because you should never assume that anything that you feel to be true will always be true, right? If you're stuck in that place, you end up seeing a repeat of all this history that we've had for the entirety of human civilization, right? There's arguments between different orthodoxies because orthodoxy exists, not because one is more right than the other, right? If the orthodoxy is willing to change, then that solves the issue altogether, right? I've seen this a lot with like modern Catholics, right? We've had, I think, I'm not a Catholic, never have been, by the way, but the current Pope is, very liberal, in particular when it comes to church matters, and that kind of bothers some people, right? So you got to think, well, if the Pope is the see of God, right? He's God's interpretation or whatever. He interprets God's word on earth. Then whatever he says must be true, right? But then if that changes every few years, then you're implying that the will of God changes every few years as well, right? So, then you can go into the argument that the atheists would bring up. Well, then that means that the Pope isn't telling you what God wants you to know. The Pope is just telling you what, the best of his understanding of what the world is. That's what he's giving you. And that's why every time you have a new Pope, the rules change. And that may be so, right? You can look at this in Scripture, right? That's why the Old Testament God is so different than the New Testament God. Well, what changed, right? This is what the Gnostics were looking at. What changed? Is it the same God, but he decided all of a sudden to grow a heart, right? He's no longer sending plagues and killing, mass murdering people.
Well, yeah, that's the Old Testament God, as you mentioned before, is, you should not take any other God, and very vengeful.
Oh, he'll attack.
Type of a God. And then the New Testament God's very loving, very I don't even know, like very forgiving. So yeah, I mean, yes, you're right on the money with that. I mean,
which unfortunately gets sent down a completely different path, right? It gets sent back down into this Old Testament wrathful path,
right?
Because if God is so forgiving, then why is there such emphasis, in particular, through the Middle Ages,
well, that's on, the people,
on sin
though.
and repentance?
Yeah, that's the people.
Right, exactly. Because that's the control mechanism.
Hold on one second. I'm going to pause this. So yeah, the vengeful versus forgiving God of the the Old Testament versus the New Testament.
But for the Gnostics, none of that really mattered, right? Because the material world is irrelevant. There's various reinterpretations of the commandments in both Gnostic scripture and the New Testament. In the New Testament, something like love your brother as you love yourself, which basically encompasses almost I think like 9 of the 10 commandments, basically. For the Gnostics, it was even simpler than that. It's just like, don't lie and don't do what you hate. And like, that's really powerful, right? Because it kind of frees you from a lot of the moral hindrances that orthodoxy brings into life, right? Don't eat this on this day, or you can't eat past sundown. You can't do work past sundown. You can't. You have to eat fish on this particular
Yeah, I
day.
mean,
You have
I
to.
never was growing up Catholic. The no meat on Friday during Lent was just like, what's the
Yeah,
point of this?
and
Maybe some sort of discipline thing, but that's stupid.
I mean, maybe,
He's
yeah. I
not a
mean,
fish. He's not a
there's
fish lover, ladies and gentlemen.
there are purposes to some of these rules, but a lot of them are more like cultural than anything else, like socioeconomic, than actually having to do with what God might want you to do. I think in the example I gave, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and they're like, how do you want us to pray? Like, how many times a day do we pray? Should we fast? Like, all these things, because like it's part of Judaic law, right, to do all these things. And Jesus is like, no, I don't care, man. Just like, don't be
Be
a liar,
good. Yeah.
don't be a douche, and do what you enjoy, and you lead a good life, right? Um, so when you look at a commandment like don't lie and don't do what you hate, it has to imply more of how you live your life to achieve your ultimate goal, right? The goal being to re-enter the pleroma. Um, and then that makes things a little bit simpler, right? It does leave it more open to interpretation, but you have this brotherhood, right? People would meet in basements, right? Because Christianity was outlawed. So people would meet in basements or in alleyways, right? Just like 2 or 3 people. 'Cause if you can't have a mega church, right? I don't know if you guys have them where you guys are at, but I'm in the South in the Bible Belt, so we have there's a church in every corner.
Hmm.
And there's some like very large stadium like churches here, right? With thousands or tens of thousands of people, multiple campuses, doing things online or whatever. Um, you can't do that, right? When your religion is outlawed, you have to kind of be in the background. You have to hide this knowledge, right? And I think that's the key to a lot of these texts, because oftentimes when modern minds try to read ancient texts, they read ancient texts with a modern sensibility. And you have to be able to like transplant yourself in time in order to understand why certain things are done a certain way, right? And so you have to speak in allegory or you're going to get killed, right? Now, you could say, well, you're a Gnostic, you don't care about physicality. I mean, okay, yes, that's true, right? And that's something that is discussed a lot in Taoism and Buddhism and Advaita and all kinds of religions, where there's certain sects of monks, for example, that purposely undergo rituals that lead to their death, right? So you have those mummified Buddhist monks, for example, where they just quit eating, right, and they just meditate. And because of the conditions of their meditation, where they're doing it, and things like that, the types of things that they eat before they begin their meditation, their bodies become mummified, and so they look like they're still alive, basically, in their meditation, but they've been dead for hundreds of years, right?
Hmm.
There was for a long time in one of the Muslim sects, uh, and I think you see this also in some of the Hindu sects. There was basically like ritualized suicide, right? Where people would get to a certain point in their journey as an elder, where they could decide to basically fast until they died, right? In the Middle Ages, you had certain very orthodox, right? So this is not like some heretical thing. Orthodox monks that would enclose themselves in usually metal, but or not metal, wooden, but oftentimes stone boxes in churches, right? And some of those bodies are still there,
They used
right?
to
Like
do that
these
to people too, like not just from
as a
a self.
punishment, yeah.
Yeah, I talk about that in that Codex Gigas episode that we did. How that was the punishment for uh, the one monk, or I mean, whatever you want to call him, That was
Yeah, but see, if you talk about that, then is it a punishment, right? Because people are actively pursuing this
right.
as a way to achieve their version of enlightenment, right? In that case, maybe not, right? So you can undergo some of these rituals and it won't make any difference.
So, I mean, some of the, like we mentioned earlier, some of these teachings or hermetic teachings that can be traced all the way back to the Old Kingdom in Egypt, like 2600 to 2200 BC, somewhere around there. I mean, that's some of that stuff's like super ancient, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of influence there going all the way back. So, again, it's weird now because I feel like, to Maurice's point the other night when we were arguing, he thinks that, everybody's losing their spirituality and religion. And, we just had Anthony on to record, and we were talking about like aliens of the gaps and metaphysics of the gaps and things like that. It seems like there is some sort of shift happening, and I don't think it's going to be a shift to nothing. I think the shift is waiting for something to come along to fill that, if that makes sense, like some ultimate thing.
Yeah, yeah. The every time you have these shifts in perspective, there's always going to be a lot of inner struggle, right, between groups, but among individuals themselves. And the thing is, our lifespans are so short that we just a lot of us get very anxious, right? You're like, oh my God, like what's happening? The world's going to crap, right? Politics sucks, the world sucks, the internet sucks, Twitter sucks, everything sucks. Um, but though everything is a mess, all is well, right? Anthony DeMello. Um, Everything might appear to suck, but it doesn't suck. That's just the way it is right now. It's your
Right.
perspective on it, right? And if you just go with it, maybe down the line you might see a change, right? Or maybe you won't, right? Maybe for the rest of your life you live in this anxiety. Are you okay with that, right? So you have to figure out how you want to deal with the anxiety, right? The anxiety is just a passing moment. Whether you want to realize it or not is up to you, right? So I choose to not live in anxiety. Many people love to live in anxiety. I have family members on anxiety medication. I know that you've had issues with anxiety and some other issues, right? OCD and things like that. Um, I feel like these are things that you can get through. But a lot of these societal changes don't happen in 10, 20 years, 50 years. They happen in 200, 300, 500 years, right? The Roman Empire didn't collapse in a decade, right? I mean, maybe it ultimately did, but it took hundreds of years to get there, right?
Yeah.
And the same is true now. So, we see a resurgence of ancient beliefs or any kind of belief that isn't what kind of is at the core makeup of our culture here in the U.S., right? And that'll change country to country. Where you say, okay, well, you think the sky is blue, I think the sky is green, right? And that starts with one person. And then if 10 people believe the sky is green, then people are saying, okay, well, maybe the sky is green, right? So let's say it is. And all of a sudden you have 1,000 people, 1,000,000 people saying the sky is green. Now the sky is no longer blue. Now the sky is green, right? Now that's a very rough example. And again, I don't want to talk politics, but you see this a lot in politics. Um, and and that's the way our ideas evolve over time. So will we see a resurgence of Gnosticism? For sure. This past year, I think has been the most talk about Gnosticism that I've been privy to since I've been studying it, right? And that feels like even within this year maybe, right? And I don't know if people are looking for something to ease their anxiety, right? So they see their current system doesn't work. Let's find a new one that might, and Gnosticism might be one of them. Maybe people start going to Shinto, or like
I mean,
there's
I
a
have a take
resurgence of
on
Wicca.
why I think that's the case. I've talked about this
Yeah, sure.
before. I see a lot of parallels between Gnosticism and simulation theory and Gnosticism, obviously, and Plato's theory of form. So if Plato's always relevant, or people talking about Plato a lot, it's bound to come up. I mean, that word is just,
Hmm.
gnosis is synonymous with Plato and everything. So, I mean, I think that there's that. But again, the simulation theory, I think, is more relevant than ever. That could be one of the front runners for this next thing that everybody believes in, right? I mean, a lot of people already do believe it, and there's some scientific evidence that could point that it's inevitable. So, yeah, I look, I think that what you're saying makes sense, and you do see these resurgence of ideas and refunneling of ideas and things like that. But I also think that there is some sort of like timeless wisdom in some of these ideas that will always echo and maybe evolve just slightly, but the foundation of it is just so solid that it just makes sense to our core, you know. So I think it's a little bit of both of those.
Well, I mean, and you're a science guy, right? So I can bring up evolution. That's how evolution works, right? You don't
Yeah.
get the perfect being just off the bat, right? There's gradual changes over time. And there's never, the ultimate version of the species. The species continues to change and morphs into other species and so on. It's the same thing with beliefs, right? There's the whole study of memetics that is like really integral to understanding philosophy and as a result religion. There's a lot of different fields that are tied together. But people just, I don't know, they don't have interest or don't have time or quite honestly just don't care, right? And it might be an unconscious don't care, but it's definitely there's a lot of don't care, right? Where they don't want to examine other perspectives, because what if, again, subconsciously, what if this changes my worldview completely, right? And then you start from scratch. I think that's why you see this a lot in writers and scientists that have been, like Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's a great educator. No, listen, I like Tyson. Okay, don't get me wrong. He's a great educator. He's got a lot of knowledge. Do I think like he should be the person, being at the center of this science education movement? Not really. Okay.
I mean, I
who that
cringe.
person is, I don't know.
I just watched he did a interview with Merlin Sheldrake on that Fantastic Fun Guy movie or documentary.
Oh, that was great. Yeah.
And the whole time they talked about like psilocybin and mushrooms and mycelium and all sorts of different things. And it just seemed like he was just wanted to like joke around and throw the easy jokes out there, and Merlin was dropping some like serious knowledge about like fungi and like mycelium and stuff like that, and it just seemed like, look, we have definitely a lot of levity when we discuss these topics, but I think that he has that like echo of like how things used to be, where some of these things are like mocked kind of a way, if that makes sense. Like it seemed like he was taking it seriously because he's doing the interview, but he wasn't really, in the sense that throwing like old cliche jokes about the whole topic out there. And it's just I think what you're talking about is stuff like that, where he is a good science communicator in the sense that he's good at conveying ideas and simplifying things for people to understand and things like that. But I think that that's a big problem, actually, is the whole science communicator thing in general. You don't really see too many people stepping up with actual skills to convey these ideas to people. And I think that's what opens the door for some of these not so great ideas, because people are better communicators or better at getting on social media or presenting themselves in a way, even though their ideas might not be as good, they might have a better communication skill set. And I think that that's what the whole problem is with the science communicator thing. So, I mean, I think that it goes both ways on that. I think that, yes, would we like to see, I think, for instance, I think Avi Loeb is a great science communicator and somebody that's great for somebody that like pushes the boundaries, but also is steeped in, deep into these topics and has the credentials and everything like that. So, yeah, I don't, I think a lot of people just push back on the Neil thing because he's also like against aliens and he always wants to debunk things, and people don't want things debunked. People want to believe in things. That's just part of our nature. So I think that that's part of the pushback as well.
That's probably a whole nother topic for a whole separate episode, but you're correct. The issue with a lot of the people that become famous as science educators, is that when they give you an answer, the answer has zero meaning, right? So it sounds great because there's a lot of fancy words, there's a lot of concepts, there's a lot of connections between concepts, but ultimately they never give you an answer to any question that's given. They just kind of give you a long story with a lot of facts, and it makes it seem true. I don't want to talk about, philosophical fallacies or anything like that. Again, that's probably a whole separate policy, a whole separate episode. But I do see that a lot with those kind of people. And I see the opposite on guys that try to, play a little bit of a jokester role, right? Particularly in philosophy. And I don't want to mention any names, but there are some guys that I think have very valid points. I don't agree with them, but I love the methodology that's used, right, to arrive at their answers. If I understand where you're coming from, because I can't have your experience, right? I'm me, you're Mike, you're Maurice. So I could never know what it's like to be either one of you, right? And if somehow we had like a Freaky Friday moment and, Maurice and I jump bodies and now I'm Maurice,
Yeah.
I still wouldn't know what it's like to be Maurice, right? Because now I am Maurice, right? I'm no longer Martin experiencing Maurice. Now I'm Maurice.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
And so this is how you have to do anytime you deal with philosophy. And it sucks, right? Because people want to be right all the time.
Yeah, that's all anything is.
If you just put that aside,
no, that's the
life
main
is so
thing.
much simpler, man.
Yeah, that's not going to happen anytime. That's just what social media is. It's just people thinking that they're right, or people. What it is too is I think some of these people, nobody's ever really listened to them, or they've thought that they've never really been listened to. So they think the internet's their chance to like get their great idea or their take but you look at the comments and it's like somebody that thought they had some sort of, epiphany or revolutionary take. 7 other people said the exact same thing, in the comments as well, or on the thread or whatever. So it's like, I think it's partially people thinking that they need to be heard because maybe they either haven't or they think that, it's some Dunning-Kruger thing. They think they have a better take and they really don't. They haven't done any research. It's a cognitive bias. I mean, I've been big on the cognitive biases lately. I've been trying to really be honest with myself. And I think that for me, I have 2 goals right now. Learn as much as I can about the topics that I'm interested in. And number 2, evaluate what I know, the epistemological lens of things, incorporating those cognitive biases. And let's see what stands up after that. And I feel like if I can learn everything, not everything, you can never learn everything, but if I can know enough about what other people think or have written or how they discuss these topics, I can then take it to that next level. I can then be that creative person that comes up with this new sprout off or this branch off or whatever. And I guess that's my goal as a person, is to always be as creative and as original as possible. Obviously, most of the things we say have foundations in other things, but again, I think that you can only truly be truly creative if you can transcend what's already known. I know you have a different take. Your take is probably to not know as much and come up with your own, but you still need those building blocks, because if you don't know what epistemology or ontology, or you don't understand how philosophy works or anything like that, you're not even going to know where to begin. So
yeah, no, and it's funny that you brought that up, because I actually I recorded last night an episode on why I don't meditate anymore, and I think we might have briefly talked about this last time I was on, but that's one of those things, right? Like, you need to get to a place in your life where you can determine whether the practice is actually useful or not. And I'm not saying that meditation isn't useful, right? It's extremely useful. I've done it a lot. Just right now I don't, right? Because I feel like I can do my meditation all day, every day, right? Just like I don't need to sit down and pray and ask God for anything, because if God's all things everywhere, then why would I need to ask God for anything? God already knows, right? So I can spend my time maybe finding some kind of connection, right? Take like a 5-second break, just close my eyes for a second, right? Just to recenter, and that's it, right? I don't need the prayer, right?
Do you think it's like a psychedelic type thing? Like you would treat psychedelics where it's like a once in a while experience thing, because I even recently I heard Hamilton Morris either wrote something or was talking about how he thinks it's most beneficial if you do it like rarely, maybe like a couple times a year, have a few experiences a year, and not like really saturate it, if that makes sense.
I think I don't know if it's quite the same. What I'm saying is I think you can get, and I let me preface by saying I'm not saying I'm an enlightened being, because
Ooh,
before I get the email, okay?
yeah, get those
I'm
emails.
not saying I'm so enlightened that I don't need to meditate. What I'm saying is I feel like the best way forward for me is to not make it a practice, but make it a habit, right? Just like I don't think about breathing, I don't need to think about meditation or prayer, right? It just happens
Mm.
always, right? And that's how you integrate a practice, right? Not just carving out 5, 10 minutes a day, but making it part of your everyday routine without even thinking about it,
It's always
right?
there too if you want to have a longer session at some
Yeah,
point.
of
You
course.
can just go
If I
back
want to
to it.
spend some time, I will. And actually, I've been wanting to go back and do some more breathwork stuff. I hadn't done psychedelics since the beginning of the year, but I had a session a couple of weeks ago, and it was fine. I mean, it was a light dose, so nothing mind blowing. Um, but I wanted to do it as a preparation because I do want to get back into that. You and I have talked a little bit offline that I want to get to writing this book about certain psychedelic rituals. And so that is kind of my way into that, right?
Mm.
It's like I'm kind of done thinking about it. I just want to kind of work on it. Um, and so I do want to get into that, but I no longer feel the need to experience that. There was a point in time last year where I was going every 6 weeks, 5, 6 weeks, on the clock, right? I had it on my schedule. And I would take, if it fell on a weekday that I was going to do it, I took a day off of work, and that's what I did that day, right? Um, Now, maybe I don't need that. Um,
Hmm.
I don't want to feel like I'm experience seeking, right? Um,
I'm right there with you,
just,
man. I feel the same way about
yeah.
both of those things. I haven't done either. I haven't really. Well, I meditated like a few weeks ago, but other than that, like I haven't had any real, even psychedelic experiences lately. I just haven't had the need for it. I feel like
Hmm.
what's going on in the world is psychedelic enough right now to just, you don't need
Well,
to throw
look,
that in the mix. There's nothing, you don't need to bring it on because everything's moving at such a rapid pace. I guess it's at this point in my life, I think I feel like I'm with you on that. Like at this point right now, it's not necessary. And obviously both those things will always be there if, you need to go back. So,
and so I'll give it to you this way. And I know you guys will know exactly what I'm talking about. If you do like a real heavy dose of mushrooms or acid or anything, and you have a great trip, right? Then you have this like afterglow for days or weeks, right? Where like everything's just freaking beautiful, right? And
mm-hmm.
glowing and just so happy, right? Um, you know, I had this experience at the beginning of the year through some things that I talked about last time I was on. Um, I haven't told most people the full story, but it was that same experience, right? But in a mystical sense with no psychedelics. And I feel like even now, what is this, 9 months, 10 months later, I still feel like this afterglow, right?
Nice.
So that's why I can be so like nonchalant about answering the question about God, right? Which is freaking crazy to me, right? For 10 years or longer, if you ask me the question, I'd tell you to go F yourself, right? Because there's no freaking
Get
way,
very
right?
angry.
And now it's like, of course, like there could be no other way, right? And so
Right.
how can this be so different, right? So the experience to me was so profound that I have that like psychedelic afterglow effect, except just on this like religious level. And fortunately, I don't feel the need to go around and tell everybody that, I met God, right? Because then people would be like, well, you're a freaking idiot, right? And
Well,
and
there's
fortunately,
Some
I know
would,
that I
some
would
it
be
should
if I
be
said
more
that.
like that anyways. I mean, if you want to discuss it on your podcast or with people, but it's when you become
Eh.
evangelical about that kind of things, that's where it becomes a slippery slope because then you're trying to convey your ideas and this is the right way and there's a wrong way, and that's how we got into this mess to begin with.
Well, and if everything is God, then why would you have to evangelize anything,
Right.
Mm,
right? Because God already knows. So
good
you don't need
point.
to evangelize anything.
Right.
That's that's been like maybe the number two topic in emails that I've gotten for the show this year. And I'd love to get back to emails, and maybe I will soon. But it's like, how come you're not doing the podcast every week anymore? Right. And there was a period of time where I was doing like twice a week. Right.
Mm.
Uh, and I mean, for me, the answer is simple and obvious. And sometimes I'm going to be like, well, I mean, do you not listen to the podcast? Like, I'm pretty sure it's obvious why. And I don't feel the need to, right? Why should I have to talk if I have nothing to say,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And there's plenty of quotes about silence in all kinds of philosophies and religions.
Just do an episode where you just sit there. and
Yeah,
not-
it's like that piano piece. The
with
guy
just the-
opens up the.
the crickets in the background.
Yeah.
It's funny that you say that because I almost did like a 40-minute episode where it was just silence. Right? I did an intro and then just silence. But I
Called
decided to
Thick
spend-
Air.
Yeah.
I thought it'd be a little too snobbish. You know what I mean?
That's a Grateful Dead thing. They used to.
I know.
end
I
up-
just read that in this book I'm reading. It's
Well,
beautiful.
it's in that documentary Anthem to Beauty where they're in the recording studio and Jerry's like, or I think it was Phil Lesh.
Bob
he-
Weir. Actually.
Oh, was it Bob Weir?
Yeah.
He's like, let's go to the desert and record 50 minutes of just desert air, and then let's go to this place and record the air there. And then they use
Yeah,
these
and
as
then
like,
blend it together.
yeah, then they use it as like a backing track on their albums. So
I love it.
Beautiful.
Yeah. No, I found the quote. It's let your speech be better than silence or be silent. Pseudo Dionysus again. He's great.
Chew on that.
well, let's wrap it up here. Do you want to do like a short Patreon here if you've got a few?
Yeah, whatever you
minutes?
need, man. Whatever
All
you
right,
need.
Well, let's wrap it up here. If anybody's interested, you can check out Martin's podcast on The Alchemical Mind at you can find him on Apple Podcasts. You can go to the alchemicalmind.com. All the links are up there. Yeah, you have some episodes where you explain all the stuff that you just talked about and why.
Yeah,
haven't done
I
any
did
in
a
a
whole
while.
series of them. If you go on the YouTube, it's been a while. And actually, I'll be going back to it because by the time this comes out, it'll have already been started. But I'm doing a series on the New Testament, and so there's going to be a lot of back and forth with some of the Gnostic texts that I didn't go over. But if you go to the YouTube page, I don't do video, so they're all just audio. But there is a whole playlist of Gnostic episodes, and I go in depth into a lot of the texts. Or you can just go on the podcast and find those. I'm pretty sure they're all labeled like parentheses Gnosticism, so this should be easy to find.
Yeah, and we didn't even really get to like the Apocryphon of John or the Gospel of Thomas or anything like that. But maybe we can do that next time you come on. But I'm
So-
sure
so what we
you've
should
talked
do-
about it on your podcast before, though. I'm sure.
So what we should do is towards the end of the year, I'm going to be doing a series on Revelations, and we should come back on and
We'll
do
do a
all
part
that
two.
we discussed,
Yeah.
but based on Revelations.
Yeah.
Because that is one of the most Gnostic texts in the Bible. And that's why nobody knows what any of it means.
Yeah, let's do it.
Beautiful.
Let's do it. So yeah, go check out Martin's podcast, and if you're interested, we are about to do a Patreon episode with Martin, and we've done ones with him in the past. You can go check that out. But go to patreon.com/MindEscapePodcast for just $2 a month. You'll get exclusive guest episodes and segments. Again, I just loaded tons of awesome stuff up there. So if you listen to our show and you like it, for just $2 a month, you basically get a whole other show, or I guess a bunch of extensions of shows. Some of them range from 15 minutes. Some of them are an hour long. It just depends. But go check that out. Find us on Discord. Then head on over to indrasweb.org. Sign up for an account. It is live. It is free. If you want to hypothesize, theorize, speculate, it's the perfect place to do it on all these topics. And if you are interested, here is the Mind Escape t-shirt we are giving away at the end of the month of October. So if you're interested and want to enter to win, all you have to do is leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, take a screenshot of it, and then email it to mindescapepodcast@gmail.com. Again, one more time, we also have a merch store. I have the link down below. So we've always had a lot of people asking about merch. We've never really done too much other than those shirts that we had for a while. So if you're interested, check out our merch store. There's t-shirts, hoodies, mugs. You know, there's stuff. Martin's got one on right now. That's the logo one. And there's some other designs on there too. It's not just our logo. You know, we've got a hashtag Let Maurice Speak one with his silhouette. I created
I like that one.
I created a composite image of the Portara of Naxos, called it Mind Escape Portal. What else do we have on there? We've got a nice psilocybin one called the Sandy, inspired by our top escapee Sandy. So go check those out. But we love everybody. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.
Peace.
Peace.